It's my pleasure now to introduce Bryan Clark, who will give you an overview of the report that we're releasing today. Let me mention a couple of things up front. One is I was particularly appreciative of the way that Bryan approached this issue, which was not to take sort of an unconstrained view of the budget. He took these issues, the constraints directly into account. Obviously, he looked at the geopolitical, geostrategic environment, and of course, the pacing challenge right now is the People's Republic of China and its Navy, and the maturation of what we call the precision strike regime, sort of the combination of extended range strike systems, increasingly precision-guided munitions, and the battle networks that help make them so effective. And he is looking at the fleet not only in that context, but also he considers the temporal factor, that there may be a novel technology today that's in sort of the 6-1 phase, but you have to look realistically, not only within the budget context and within the threat context, but also in terms of what you can reasonably expect of technology over time. And it's, I think, a remarkable effort, but it's not surprising. I've had the good fortune of working with Bryan for a little over a year now. We were able to pry him away from Admiral Greenert, who I think still holds a grudge against me for the fact that Bryan left as sort of his right-hand intellectual man and came to CSBA. But we've worked together on a couple of projects, and I constantly find myself learning a lot more from Bryan than I think he benefits from the exchange with me. So rather than listen to me, let me turn things over to Bryan, who will give you a rundown on the report and its key factors and points. Bryan?
Go ahead and get the computer going here. So while I do that, though, thank you very much, Andrew. That was a very nice introduction. He's a terrific boss, a fantastic guy to work for. So it's been great over at CSBA. Also, thank you to Senator Baldwin and to Representative Ribble for coming. I know they had to leave to go off and vote. There's apparently a lot going on the Hill right now. I'm not really sure. I haven't been following the news very much, but there's some stuff happening. So I'll go through a brief I put together that summarizes the study's findings and the recommendations in it. And then at the end, we can do Q&A. Not everybody in here, I think, has the same level of familiarity with the surface fleet. So it'd be good, I think, just to go through the report's findings and then talk at the end about kind of specific things you want to discuss in more detail. And so I'll go through this fairly briskly, and then we can revisit parts that you think need to be discussed more. The first thing I talk about sort of is the approach I took to the study. And as Andrew said, I thought it was really important to step back and look at the future of the surface fleet, but look at it in the near to midterm, now until 2025 or so, and do it with the idea that I'm going to modify the fleet I have to become the fleet of 2025, as opposed to starting from scratch, like a lot of studies sometimes do, with a blank sheet and say, well, here's the fleet I would like to have instead of the fleet that I have today. So I really focused on what could be achievable in the next 10 years in terms of creating a surface fleet that's got the capabilities that it needs for the environment in which we think we're going to operate. And then leave as a separate issue what the fleet after that looks like, which I know that within the Navy right now there's some discussion about, well, what does the next surface combatant look like? What's the fleet of 2035 look like? I thought that's a discussion better left for another day, and we can focus now on trying to make the fleet we have now better able to address the security challenges that we're faced with within the budgetary constraints we have. So I'll talk a little bit about where the fleet is today and why this is the time for this examination and this evolution, if you will, of the surface fleet. I'll talk about some of the major trends, as Andrew was saying, that are going to shape our decisions regarding what the surface fleet needs to look like and the constraints that are going to impart themselves upon us as we try to do that. And then I'll talk about some concepts that result from that analysis that we think that the Navy should implement as a way of giving the surface fleet the ability to restore its offensive capability in the face of emerging threats and challenges, some of which have already manifested themselves. And then I'll talk in the course of that about some of the specific capability and program implications. What do I think the Navy should be doing with regard to buying things or changing programs that exist today? The first thing is, so that's, those words are much smaller than I thought they were going to be. But the big thing is the surface Navy, as we said before, is at a crossroads. If you think about it, people that follow this sort of thing, at the turn of this century, we envisioned having a new surface fleet with a family of new surface ships, the CGX, the DDX destroyer, and the LCS. And these ships were going to be a new generation of surface combatants. They were going to operate using a concept of net-centric warfare, meaning they could each specialize to a great degree in terms of the things they do. So the DDX would be very focused on strike and land attack, and the CGX would be very focused on air defense, and the LCS would do a lot of littoral missions like anti-submarine warfare and mine warfare. They would all then connect with each other via a network that would allow them to seamlessly coordinate their operations so that each ship didn't have to be capable of every mission on Earth. They just had to be capable of a limited set of missions, and the fleet overall would coordinate to conduct that full range of missions. Well, now we're at a point where each of those ships was either canceled or truncated. And the idea of net-centric warfare, where the network is where the warfighting occurs, it's a little bit challenged right now because of the anti-access capabilities that our enemies are likely to field, things like jamming and communications denial. So the idea of having a net-centric force that's able to seamlessly coordinate its operations with each other may not be something that happens in reality. So we have to think about, well, where do we want to take the surface Navy now? The concept around which we'd organized it is sort of having a problem. The surface fleet that we envisioned having is certainly not going to come into fruition. What do we do with the surface fleet instead? Well, right now, in the next couple of years, the Navy has a series of decisions facing it that will allow it to significantly shape the Navy of 2025. And those decisions, if made in a way that's judicious, I think would provide a capability in the fleet that would be dramatically improved from what it has today and would be in line with what it needs to have for that operating environment of 2025. And those are some of them listed up there, but it has to do with the phase modernization of cruisers, the kinds of weapons and sensors we're going to put on the next generation of surface combatants like AMDR or like the long-range anti-ship missile. The final specifications of the Flight 3 DDG are going to be decided. And then, as Senator Baldwin discussed, the new small surface combatant and what its characteristics are and what its capabilities will be. So what I've done here is in the study, I focused on large and small surface combatants, and I'll talk a little bit in the course of this about why I thought we should focus on just surface combatants and why I thought that was a valid bound to establish for the study. And then I focused on the mid-2020s as the time frame in which these capabilities would need to come into being, as opposed to some far future environment. The mid-2020s is important also, I felt, because that's where the decisions of today are going to impact. So we have the ability now to shape that fleet, as opposed to the fleet of 2035, which we can't really shape yet. All right, so the trends that we have to address. First, as Andrew mentioned, anti-access area denial challenges are growing. China is the pacing threat. This shows the most stressing situation that we're likely to find ourselves in from a warfighting perspective. Lots of capabilities comprehensively deployed with a reconnaissance capability to deliver them at long ranges. So this is the likely result that you'll have from the advent of precision weapons being ubiquitously available to all the players in a particular competition. But it's not just about China. Iran, as we know, has some of these same precision weapons capabilities. They have the ability to deliver them at relatively long ranges. One thing that you'll note is some countries like Iran can take a geography and exploit it to their advantage. So Iran doesn't need to have an extremely long range, for example, anti-ship ballistic missile or anti-ship cruise missile. They only need to have it go a couple hundred miles to be able to affect the areas that we as a naval force would have to operate to do something against them. So geography favors them and it gives them the ability to do this cheaper and easier. And they can take advantage of commercial technology that enables some of these weapons to be essentially fire and forget. They don't have to train people extensively to use them. They don't have to have a very robust network to communicate or to provide sensor information to them. They're fairly easy to use. So these things are going to continue to proliferate around the world. It's not just these two countries. It's going to then be, North Korea will get some of these capabilities, and then Syria will get some of these capabilities, and then potential hotspots around the world are going to continue to have these kind of anti-access challenges associated with them. So the surface fleet's going to need to be able to defend itself in these environments and then take the fight to the enemy to be able to destroy his weapons launch platforms. The other thing that's going to happen is instability will continue to be on the rise. So on the top part, that's from the National Intelligence Council's recent 2030 study looking at what the world is likely to be like in 2030, but looking at the trend in conflicts. And that top line, the red line, if you will, shows the total number of conflicts as they defined them going on per year around the world. And then this is the number of state-on-state conflicts that are a component of that. What that shows is that conflict is on the rise, but state-on-state conflict is actually decreasing. And this chart here, which comes from another source, is also showing that same trend, What that means is that the surface fleet's going to be an increasing demand to do the kinds of security cooperation and training and partnership activities that it does today in places like Africa or in Southeast Asia or in the Middle East. Countries are going to continue to ask for the United States to support them in terms of their foreign internal defense training and in terms of their ability to protect their territorial waters and their fisheries resources, for example. So we can't ignore this demand signal that's going to continue to rise as we go forward. The other big trend is the budget. As Congressman Ribble mentioned, budgets are constrained, but if you think about over the long haul, I got this data from my colleague Todd Harrison, but if you look at over the long haul, budgets in DoD have risen pretty significantly since this is 1948, and that's the 2018 based on the fit-up of the budget that was submitted with 2015's budget. But they're going up pretty steadily over time. It's not likely the Department of Defense is going to get a large amount of additional money. So we can't think about some large top-line increase being the savior to our surface fleet equipping. So we've got to come up with a way to equip the surface fleet better that does not require a large amount of additional money. Also, if you look at the budget shares that are inherent in here, this is Air Force, Navy, Army, and then DoD-wide accounts growing over time. The budget shares between the services have stayed roughly the same in terms of a percentage over time, except for a brief time back here when the New Look strategy gave the Air Force a lot more money at the expense of the Army and the Navy. But overall, that's been the trend. So it's unlikely the Navy's going to get a lot of additional money relative to the other services in the future. So we can't depend on that saving the surface fleet either. We've got to come up with a way to equip the surface fleet affordably. And the last thing I'll note is down here, this shows the budget authorities by type of spending. So that's healthcare, the little orange thing. Military personnel is there. Operations and maintenance is the green one. Research and development and procurement is the purple one. Well, you can see over time how personnel costs and operations and maintenance costs are growing and crowding out the research, development, and procurement that we would have relied on to develop future surface capabilities, future surface combatants, future surface weapons. So we got to be able to do this in a way that's affordable. Given those trends and given those constraints, then there's a series of concepts that I thought were important for the Navy to implement as a way to develop the ability for the surface fleet to go on the offense, take the fight to the enemy, and get out of the defensive mode it currently is in. These challenges, if you think about the anti-access challenges we're starting to encounter, sort of harken back to the Cold War. And those of you who are old, like me or older, some of you are even older than me, but the last time we encountered a challenge like this was the Cold War, and the Navy came up with what was known as the outer air battle. And the idea here is we used, you can see down here, this is the blue force, those are the good guys, and the red guys are the bad guys. The blue guys, the U.S. force, had carrier-based aircraft, the F-14 with the Phoenix missile, specially designed to have the range necessary to intercept the bad guy bombers before they could launch anti-ship cruise missiles at the surface fleet. So the idea was they were going after the Archer before the Archer could shoot the arrows at the surface fleet. An outer air battle was all based on that idea. The surface fleet contributed to this with a concept called up, out, and down, which Admiral Metcalf put out in the same time frame. And the idea there was that the surface fleet was going to go up to use the Aegis combat system, which was new at the time, to shoot down bombers that did get past this Phoenix and F-14 barrier. They were going to use the Harpoon anti-ship cruise missile to shoot any Soviet surface ships before they were able to approach within launch range of the surface fleet. And they would go down using new anti-submarine warfare capabilities to take out Soviet submarines before they could shoot anti-ship cruise missiles at the fleet. So this whole concept was based on shooting the Archers before they could launch their weapons. And this was the way that the Navy was going to fight back in the Cold War. And this was going to happen both in the Mediterranean, where the surface fleet or the Navy was going to move in to try to execute strikes in the Soviet Union from the Eastern Mediterranean. And it was also going to happen up in the Northern Atlantic and in the Baltic, up in the Barents Seas, where the Navy was going to then push into the northern part of Russia using carrier-based aircraft. Well, if you look at today's situation, it's a lot different. We could not execute a thing like the outer air battle today because if you look at the current missile relationship between the United States and its potential adversaries, up here, all the red lines, those show the different types of anti-ship cruise missiles that are available either on the open market or to our potential adversaries, and that's 300 nautical miles. That's the bad guy ship or airplane, and that's the cruise missile range. there is our little US surface combatant, and the one missile that he has is the Harpoon, which is this shortest one here. These other two are anti-ship cruise missiles that are available on the open market, but that the US does not currently use or field or in its surface ships. So you can see we're at a significant range disadvantage relative to our potential adversaries when it comes to shooting them before they shoot us. We couldn't execute a thing like outer air battle today. We have to come up with a way to increase the range at which we can strike enemy airplanes, submarines, and surface ships, and we have to come up with a way to generate that capacity. So that gets into the concepts that we're proposing. So the first one is the central idea of offensive sea control, which is sea control being the ability to take control of and hold areas of ocean against an adversary. It's the same thing as if you thought about on land control. I want to go take a chunk of land, hold it for my own, prevent enemies from coming in and taking it back from me. How this works is we've got our blue is the good guys, the US forces. Red are the bad guys. Those are the potential adversary forces or enemy forces. And our surface ships need the ability to reach out and attack surface ships, airplanes, and submarines past the range of those platforms' anti-ship cruise missiles. That way we can defeat them before they get to us. Today we can't do that. We need new weapons in order to do that. We also need, to some degree, integrated fire control systems that would allow us to gain the targeting information on these guys, because this is over the horizon. The horizon of a surface ship is generally about 100, or rather 10 miles based on the sensors that it has deployed on the ship. So anything past 10 miles, you generally are going to, on the surface, you're going to have over the horizon targeting for. If it's high up in the air, you can see it farther away. You know, like the horizon goes out for something that's farther up in the air. And then for submarines, their horizon is based on whatever you're able to achieve using sonar systems. But using over-the-horizon sensors, you'll be able to supply data to these ships, which then can reach out and attack these targets. Today, we rely on the battle force to be able to do this operation because surface ships can't do them by themselves. We depend on submarines to do anti-surface warfare. We depend on airplanes to do anti-submarine warfare. That all works if the entire battle force is deployed in that particular operation. If I'm escorting an individual ship, I'm not going to have the benefit of a carrier strike group with me to do that. I need to be able to protect that escorted ship and myself without the benefit of their contribution. So that's the first thing, and sort of central is the idea of defeating the enemy weapons launchers before they can launch their weapons. To do that, the first thing we have to address is the inadequate capacity of our vertical launch system magazine on our surface ships. Today, if you look at a cruiser or destroyer, the large surface combatants the Navy has, they have about 100 vertical launch system cells, and those are all filled with weapons of some type or another. If you are using our standard shot doctrine of shoot, shoot, look, shoot, which means every air threat that comes in, I shoot 2 missiles at it, and then I wait to see if I hit them or not, and then I shoot another missile at it, and you look at the degree of capability of your missiles that you're shooting. If they are perfect, meaning every missile I shoot hits the target and kills it, then I can hit 50 things before I run out of missiles. If I change my shot doctrine to just shoot and then wait and then shoot again, then I can maybe get 100 things. That made sense when I was only dealing with maybe a dozen air threats coming in at a time. But today, an anti-ship cruise missile costs about $2.5 million, and a destroyer costs about $2 billion. So if I'm the bad guy, I'm going to launch a lot of cruise missiles at a potential target surface ship to destroy it because it's a beneficial cost advantage to me. And these anti-ship cruise missiles are getting smaller, easier to carry in large numbers, and it can be deployed from ashore as well as from airplanes, as well as from surface ships, as well as from submarines. So there's a lot of sources from which they can come. You can bring a lot of them to bear. You can easily overwhelm the capacity of a surface ship's VLS magazine just doing defensive anti-air warfare. And that shows kind of a notional loadout of what the VLS magazine on a destroyer would be. So we got to come up with a way to do something about this defensive anti-air warfare concept to give us more capacity so I can shift some of this capacity to offense. Right now, that's your offensive capacity essentially, is you got some Tomahawks, you got some Harpoons, which aren't long enough range to really do anything, and then you got some vertical launch ASROCs, which are very short range as well. So the concept I'm proposing for defensive anti-air warfare will be a significant paradigm shift for the surface fleet. What I'm proposing is that instead of the current layered defense, where I'm going to shoot an air target multiple times as he's approaching me, I'm going to only shoot at him in one defensive layer, which is right here at 30 nautical miles. The reason for that is if I use my former construct, which I have today, I'm going to launch at an incoming air threat, like an airplane or a cruise missile. I'm going to launch SM-6s at him first. If I miss, then I'm going to launch SM-2s at him. If I miss, then I'm going to launch ESSMs at him. Well, what that means is I'm going to launch my SM-6, which is my most expensive and largest missile, first at everything that comes at me, essentially. And the cost exchange there is very disadvantageous to me, because this costs about $4 million, and if his cruise missile costs $2.5 million, I'm going to shoot 2 of those at his $2.5 million cruise missile, and I'm basically spending 3 times as much money to take out the one thing that he sent. So because we send the most expensive and largest thing first, we're going to end up at a disadvantageous cost ratio and disadvantageous capacity relationship. So we got to dial in the defensive umbrella to be 30 nautical miles. We could be much denser, because by going back to 30 nautical miles, I'm now able to bring to bear new capabilities or other capabilities like electronic warfare, which can reach out to this range depending on the altitude of the incoming threat. I can shift my defensive missile to be ESSM, which is something I can carry 4 to a VLS cell rather than an SM-2, which I can carry 1 to a VLS cell. That gives me a much greater capacity for air defense, so I can make this a very dense umbrella. It also allows me to then integrate new capabilities like lasers and railgun, which I'll talk about in a second. Those systems are not going to be able to reach out to the long ranges that an SM-6 would of more than 100 miles. They're only going to reach out to 10 to 30 miles. So you've got to think about an air defense concept that integrates them in a way that allows me to rely on the laser or the railgun to shoot the thing, or shoot the incoming threat, rather than expending an interceptor to do it. Right now, our air defense concept takes all of our new high-tech things like electronic warfare, railgun, and laser, and would use those as only backstops to defend against leakers. We have to start using those capabilities first so that we can reduce the number of interceptors we have to employ. And then the last thing is the air defense interceptors that we do have, the SM-2, the SM-6, these very long-range missiles, they should be used to go against aircraft and take out aircraft before they're able to attack us. That's a much more beneficial cost relationship. If I send a $4 million SM-6 to shoot down a $40 million airplane, that's a lot better than using it to shoot down cruise missiles. What that does in terms of capability and program implications is, up here, our defensive layer now at the 30-mile point is going to incorporate electronic warfare systems, lasers, the electromagnetic railgun, and this smaller ESSM-sized interceptor, which I can carry 4 to a VLS tube to increase my capacity. Then I'm recommending that we also look at incorporating laser on the Flight 3 DDG. Right now, lasers are maturing to the point where a 300 to 500 kilowatt laser, which would have the ability to do air defense, is going to be mature in the mid-2020s. The Navy does not today have a plan to incorporate this kind of laser into a surface ship until the introduction of a new surface combatant, which won't occur until the 2030 timeframe. But the Flight 3 DDG would have sufficient extra power and cooling to incorporate that laser. And the last thing is with regard to electromagnetic railgun, which is a lot of discussion about, it's very sexy, has a lot of photos on the internet. Recommend taking one of those 32 megajoule railguns, similar to the one that's going on the Millinocket right here, for testing next year, and incorporate those onto a limited number of JHSVs and use those to augment the air defense for carrier strike groups when they're deployed. You could add to, just like we're doing with the Millinocket, you could add sufficient extra power and cooling to accommodate the electromagnetic railgun. This would give the Navy the experience of gaining the familiarity of using it in air defense, incorporating it into the air defense network in the advance of bringing it into the fleet as part of a new surface combatant in the 2030s. But if we don't start getting into the fleet now, it's going to be very difficult to incorporate that capability into the fleet later. So why not do that now when the technology is mature? The next thing is, in terms of generating capacity for offense, if we do something with air defense to try and generate some more VLS cells that could go to offensive missiles, the next thing would be to try to make the missiles we have able to do more and get more effective capacity out of them. So what I'm proposing is that we emphasize 3 characteristics in the generation of weapons being developed now. So for example, the long-range anti-ship missile is development now. The next generation, the land attack weapon, is in development now. There's nothing going on with regard to the ASROC, but I'll talk about that in a second. But the 3 characteristics I'm recommending we emphasize are a relevant capability, which has to do with range primarily, is make sure the weapon can outrange its counterpart that the adversary will have, so I can shoot him before he shoots me. Make sure it has multi-mission applicability, because today our VLS cells are filled with largely single mission weapons, meaning if I go out to sea and I've got this lineup of weapons and my mission profile changes from being primarily air defense, for example, to then land attack, I have to go back in and change out my missile loadout to then go back out and do the new mission. If instead I made my missiles more multi-mission capable, I would be able to shift from one mission to another without having to return to port. That's important, especially if you look at a conflict environment or in the ramp up to a conflict where I don't have the time and I don't have the luxury of bringing ships back in to reload them because I'm afraid the conflict's going to shift in a new direction. So we'll talk a little bit about what some ideas there are. And then the last thing is smaller size. Make the weapon smaller so I can fit more to a VLS cell. One thing to look at especially is if you look, this chart here shows the estimated size of a weapon, which is the weight right here, compared to its range. So the longer a weapon is in range, the bigger the weapon is. That makes sense. But if you see here, that goes up fairly linearly over time as you increase range. But the biggest impact on the weapon size is its warhead size. So these different curves show up here, that's a 1,000-pound warhead, or rather 2,000-pound warhead. And this curve down here is a 100-pound warhead. So what we can do right away to shrink our weapon size in this new generation of weapons is use smaller warheads and take advantage of the fact that we're going up against adversaries who are starting to field more and more sophisticated equipment, similar to our own, that would be easy to mission kill with a smaller warhead. I don't need a 1,000-pound warhead to take out a radar system that's relatively fragile, that a 200-pound warhead would be fully capable of eliminating, taking that guy out of the fight because he no longer has the sensor capability to empower his weapons. Then in terms of specific weapons recommendations, what I talk about is making the LRASM, the Navy's currently developing, multi-mission. Make that land attack and anti-ship capable so that I can use it for either mission. One way to do that would be to extend its range by making the warhead smaller so I can make it capable of reaching the kinds of ranges a Tomahawk reaches and also being capable of doing anti-ship attack. Getting a long-range ASROC. Today's anti-submarine warfare rocket is only capable of going 12 miles. The submarine-launched anti-ship cruise missile that you're going up against has a range of about 150 miles. So if I'm shooting an ASROC, I am already 10 times inside the range of the adversary that I'm attacking. So I have to come up with a longer-range anti-submarine weapon. I could talk a little bit later in the question and answer about how that's beneficial. Using the SM-6 for offense instead of defense, using it to shoot down airplanes instead of using it to shoot down anti-ship cruise missiles. And the last thing is you're using ESSM or a missile like that as my defensive air defense weapon. To grow my capacity further, once I've figured out how to get more out of each VLS magazine, I need then to think about how to get more VLS magazines out there. Now, transitioning to how do I get more ships able to do offensive operations? Well, one thing that we could do is the Navy's proposed this idea of a phased modernization to the cruiser fleet. And this is represented on here. This is what the shipbuilding plan shows in terms of cruiser inventory over time. The red line shows what cruiser inventory will be if we do not do that phased modernization. And you'll have no cruisers, according to the Navy, by FY29, which of course is the time period. This is when the SSBN-X, the Ohio replacement program, will be consuming a lot of the shipbuilding budget. So it'd be nice to have an alternative, a way to generate large surface combatant capacity in this time frame. This is the Navy's recommendation. For a relatively small amount of money, you're able to modernize these ships, keep them in the inventory out to the 2040s, keeping their VLS magazines, and keeping their ability to do air defense commander, which is a unique capability that the cruisers have that we need to retain in the fleet. The next thing to maximize the number of VLS magazines or ships that we can use for offense is to shift the ballistic missile defense stations that we're currently doing with ships to shore. What this depicts here is this is just a notional picture of Japan, obviously. What we have today in Japan and the Middle East is about 2 ships doing ballistic missile defense patrols continuously on station. Well, those 2 ships, out here doing ballistic missile defense to defend against, North Korean craziness or whatever, that takes 4 ships to generate, because each one of these ships is sourced from Yokosuka, and they're in a forward deployed naval force status. So it takes 2 ships to maintain those stations each. That's 4 ships consumed right there. If you look in Europe, we're doing a similar thing with the European phased adaptive approach for ballistic missile defense. We're doing a similar thing in the Middle East to protect some of our partners there. Overall, the Navy's got about 18 cruisers or destroyers tied up in doing ballistic missile defense. While they're doing that mission, they're not able to do other missions generally because their maneuverability is so constrained while they're doing the ballistic missile defense mission. They got to remain in a relatively small box. So by putting these capabilities ashore with the Aegis Ashore system that we're using in Europe and using those in new places like Japan, or the Middle East, we could free up ships that would then be able to go on offense instead of being stuck in a defensive role entirely. I even recommend that the Navy should consider trading in, if you will, one destroyer to buy a number of these Aegis Ashore systems, because the payoff in terms of the number of ships you return to offensive duty is much higher than the cost of the one ship you had to pay to buy those systems. And then the last thing I talk about in terms of growing the number of ships able to do offense is the idea that we modify or rather we create this new small surface combatant, which I recommend being a modified LCS. It would have the ability to do offensive missions as well. So we should think about concepts where we can put those ships out as part of an offensive SAG, like a surface action group, if you will. That's what we have here. So that's 3 of these new small surface combatants. I envision that those would be VLS equipped, vertical launch system equipped, so they would have these same offensive weapons that we discussed earlier. They'd be able to execute offensive operations against submarines, against ships, or potentially against aircraft by using some kind of off-hull targeting. So one way to do it would be this concept, which is you've got 2 small surface combatants here. They are VLS equipped, so they're using ESSM as their air defense system. So they have about a 30-mile umbrella over both of them. They provide mutually supporting air defense. They're using their radars and radiating, so they want to stay away from these guys so they can avoid being detected. They send one guy out here, that's another small surface combatant, but he's not radiating. He's doing essentially what we called in the Cold War like a silent SAM type technique, where he's listening using his electronic surveillance systems and his towed array, his passive towed array, for submarine or surface ship threats, passing that information back to the shooters who then shoot missiles to engage these threats, both submarines and surface ships. Concepts like this would allow us to take our offensive capacity, put it in a larger number of ships, create a much harder targeting problem for the enemy, and enable the surface Navy to take the fight back on offense as opposed to doing it on defense, as they're likely, or as they're mostly forced to do today. So shifting now to those small surface combatants. This chart shows what the Navy's surface combatant force structure will look like between now and 2044 based on the shipbuilding plan. All the blue stuff are large surface combatants, and all the orangish stuff are small surface combatants. So a couple things to take away from this are the requirement for 88 large surface combatants is right there. That's that line. And if you look inside that, you've got about 55 that are going to be tied up as carrier strike group escorts. You got about 18 that are tied up doing BMD stations. That leaves only about 15 that are able to do other stuff. Those other things that have to be done are missions like escort missions. In wartime or even in ramp up to conflict, we need a ship that's able to defend non-combatant ships from air threats. Well, right now the LCS couldn't do that because its rolling airframe missile doesn't have the range to defend another ship. So we would have to use large surface combatants to do that mission. So that's 15 ships that are available for that. That'll be rapidly consumed and probably exceeded. That also means these are the 15 ships I have available to fill in when I don't have enough small surface combatants. So if you look up here, that shows a huge gap in the number of small surface combatants I have today, that's FY15, relative to the number I'm required to have by the Navy's force structure assessment, which is 52. I have a huge gap that's getting filled today with large surface combatants. So I'm using up my large surface combatant offensive capacity to do security cooperation, training, and constabulary missions is what I call them here. We need a new approach to come up with to be able to do those missions as well. So a couple of the things I talk about in here is one, we need a ship that's able to defend itself and others to do this escort mission, so I don't have to do that with large surface combatants, of which I don't have enough. I also need to come up with a way to do small surface combatant missions like security, constabulary missions, and training. And I talk about ways to do that as well. So the first thing is, in terms of the new follow-on surface combatant, the small surface combatants are going to replace the LCS. I recommend that we modify an LCS to be that ship, and that we take only one variant to do that, because we already have a problem with commonality in the surface fleet. We don't want to increase the commonality problem by doing the small surface combatant in both variants of LCS. I've talked to the shipbuilders that build LCS and been out to the shipyards. They both are confident, and they showed me plans where you could install the following capabilities on either variant. So I proposed a 24-cell VLS system, vertical launch system, so you have commonality between the LCS or the small surface combatant and the rest of the fleet. You can use the same weapons between them. You can use the same air defense concept that I discussed earlier. Put a 3D radar on them, but not necessarily a spy radar, so a small 3D radar that's able to support an ESSM-like missile. keep the same gun, and then put the entire ASW mission package on the ship, which analysis has indicated is going to be very effective in littoral and open ocean environments. This combination of capabilities would give the ship the same characteristics as the frigates that it was intended to replace, meaning it can do air defense of itself and another ship, it can do anti-submarine warfare, and it could do surface warfare. And I would also recommend that once the Navy's finalized this design, is to go back and backfit into the rest of the LCS fleet, the Flight Zeros that we have today, selective parts of these capabilities. In particular, I would recommend that they put VLS cells onto some of the existing Flight Zero LCS to allow them to be able to do offensive operations and improve their defensive capacity. The second thing I recommend with regard to LCS is that the Navy move away from the current rotational crewing concept and put dedicated crews on each of these ships. The reason being, the concept right now would have 3 crews manning 2 ships. One of those ships would be overseas, and so your 3 crews would rotate between the 2 ships, and one of the hulls would be always overseas. And these are the places where they envision them being: Singapore, Bahrain, and Sasebo. That gives you, if you look at the 52 ships they were originally going to buy, that would mean 26 hulls are overseas all the time, and you're manning those with, 3 times the number of crews. So, so math in public. So that ends up being 52 plus 26, so 78 crews. So 78 crews manning 52 ships, of which 26 are overseas. Well, now we're only buying 32 LCS, which means in that crewing concept, 16 would be overseas. I could keep 16 ships overseas instead by just forward deploying them there in the same locations that I currently forward deploy small surface combatants. Today we have 15 ships actually in Singapore. We got 10 patrol craft, or 14, and 4 minesweepers, all forward deployed with their families for the most part, living overseas in Bahrain. We have 4 minesweepers currently deployed overseas with their families and everybody in Sasebo. In Singapore, we do have rotational crews, but we could work through some way to eventually get those ships forward deployed with the crews living there, and eventually maybe their families as well. But you could forward base the 16 hulls overseas and be able to keep the same presence as with the rotational crewing concept, but with 16 fewer crews, which would save the Navy quite a bit of money. And the Navy keeps talking about how personnel is the most expensive thing they have. Well, that's 16 crews, that's almost 2,000 people that they wouldn't need to hire now if you go with a single crew rather than a rotational crew. Not to mention the fact that its complexity is much less. So that's the rotational crewing concept there. There's a lot of moving parts there, difficult to keep track of. And here is the concept if you go with either LCS forward deployed or LCS CONUS. And these would be managed just like our current surface fleet ships. Another thing I recommend in terms of now addressing those small surface combatant missions that today we're going to have to use large surface combatants for is separate the LCS mission packages from the LCS program. The mission packages should be treated as their own standalone entities, because then I could take those, we could put them on a range of ships and use those other ships of the national fleet to do some of the small surface combatant missions that today I'm going to have to send a cruiser out to do, or a destroyer, because I don't have any hulls. The JHSV, the TAKE, the Float Forward Staging Base, or the MLP Mobile Landing Platform all could host mission package elements or whole mission packages to support the kinds of operations that I would otherwise use a small surface combatant for, and in the absence of them, I would have to use a large surface combatant like a cruiser or destroyer for. We should also consider expanding the non-combatant fleet. JHSV, for example, is a very affordable option for the Navy to increase the number of hulls it has. And if you were able to separate the mission packages from the LCS and make them standalone, I could put them onto this ship to be able to go do missions when I don't have enough small surface combatants to go around, which is going to be important as instability continues to grow around the world. So to wrap it all up, the idea is the surface Navy is at this crossroads, but we've got opportunities to make decisions that would allow the surface fleet to equip itself so that in 2025 it's able to go back on offense, address the capacity challenges it has, and prepare itself to incorporate capabilities that in the 2030s are going to be ready to go into the surface fleet, things like railgun and lasers in particular. We also need to get back to offense. You know, the idea of turning the surface fleet back into an offensive asset that then forces the adversary to have to deal with is very important, and the ways to do that are straightforward and are within the Navy's grasp and could be done within the next 10 years. And that's it. So I'm ready for your questions.